Hello friends! By popular request, I am sharing my Sony menu settings today. If you are new here, hello, my name is Leigh. I make videos on anything where you might have a camera in your hand, including gear reviews, technique, inspiration, adventure, and like today, logistical. Sony menus are extensive and they can be intimidating. You have a lot of things in them to customize how your camera behaves. Some complain about it, others love it for the flexibility. Me? It took some getting used to, but in this video I will show you the settings that I change when I first get a Sony camera in my hands, as well as things that I might change as I'm using the camera. I'll also show you how I use the My Menu and Function menu, as well as the configurable buttons on the camera and lens to simplify things for myself. This is definitely not a complete walkthrough of all of the Sony menus. That would be a much longer video. Also, I will be showing you all of this on my own a7R IV. Not every Sony body has the same menu options, and the new a7S III has completely redesigned menus, but generally, the terminology is the same. So even if you don't have an a7R IV, this video may be helpful for you. Before we jump into the menus, I would like to thank KEH, who is kindly sponsoring this portion of the video. If you are not familiar with them, KEH buys and sells used gear. I use KEH to sell my own gear, and I have purchased used gear from them as well. For me, the process of selling my pieces of gear one by one through other methods became obnoxious. I had non-paying bidders and people trying to scam me on the gear that I sold them. It cost me more time and money than it was worth, which is how I came to start using KEH in the first place before I ever started working with them. The process of getting a quote online or through a virtual appointment is quick and easy. Purchasing used gear from them is easy as well, and what you receive is what you expect as advertised, which is equally as important. I don't take sponsors unless I truly trust the company. In this case, I was using KEH before they contacted me about working together. Likewise, I don't join many affiliate programs, but this is one that I did want to take part in. That means if you use my links and codes, they're in the description of this video, to buy or to sell, you get a discount off of your purchase or a bonus on the sale of your gear. And I get a little commission. It's one thing that helps keep this channel up and running, so thank you to those of you that use those links. Okay, back to the menus. Starting at the start, you'll see that there are icons across the top of the screen, and then each one of these has some number of screens worth of settings. Each has an icon as well as a color. I like that each has a different color because depending on how you remember things, this could be a really helpful tool. In the first menu, the Red Camera Settings 1 menu, we'll see that there are 15 pages in this menu, and the first page is Quality/Image Size 1, which tells us there will be at least more than one page of the same category of settings, so that's one quick way to know where you are in the menus. First on the list is File Format. What I choose here depends on the camera and the situation. I typically leave my a7R IV on RAW because of the type of photography I typically do with it, but there are certainly occasions where I could switch this or other cameras over to JPEG. The next option is RAW file type. I choose compressed, and then JPEG quality and image size are typically at the highest settings available. Skipping down a bit, I do want to point out APS-C/Super 35. This will limit the image to the APS-C crop. I leave it on auto typically, so if I do use an APS-C lens, the camera will automatically switch over, but I do switch it to on sometimes if I want a cropped image, especially when I am capturing video. It will maintain whatever video resolution I've chosen, which we'll get to later in the menu, but what happens is that I'll appear a bit zoomed in, 1.5x to be exact. And onto page 2 of the camera settings menu, which is the second page of Quality/Image Size. I want to point out long exposure noise reduction. I have this turned off because when I am creating long exposures, I am typically doing astrophotography, and often I am creating time lapses where I prefer to keep the processing in camera to a minimum. That being said, sometimes I will turn this on if I don't need to worry about that. Next is shoot mode/drive 1. The first thing here is drive mode, but I don't think I've ever set this in the menu here. I always set it in the function menu, which I'll show you later in this video. My setting here will change depending on what I'm capturing. The only other thing I use here is the interval shooting function for those times that I want to create a time lapse. The settings within this will depend upon the situation, but I do typically turn on silent shooting here. So moving on to autofocus 1. Like drive mode, I typically set my focus mode and focus area in the function menu or with buttons on the camera, but I can say that the setting I use most often is AFC and tracking flexible spot small. There are certainly times when I'll change these, and each situation is different, but I have found this to be reliable for most situations. We'll come back to this in a moment though. Jumping to autofocus 2. In face/eye autofocus settings, I typically have this turned on and either on human or animal, depending on the situation. When I have this turned on, but also have the other autofocus modes set the way I did to AFC and tracking flexible spot, the camera will pick up and focus on the faces or eyes when they are detected in the frame, but if there are no faces or eyes, the camera will focus in the area I have chosen. A note on autofocus modes. I said the way that I typically have the camera set, but that's really just my baseline. Every day is a little bit different for me. I might be in the situation where AFS makes more sense, or if I'm filming myself or doing self-portraits, I might use AFC and wide autofocus with face detect on. Or if I'm doing street photography, I might turn face detect off so no eyes or faces get picked up because I want to focus on buildings or anything else. In autofocus tracking sensitivity, I have this set to the most responsive, where for stills photography, the camera will be the most sensitive when tracking a subject, but I could change this if I wanted the camera to be less quick to adjust focus when the subject moves or when something gets in the way of the subject. I typically don't change anything on autofocus 3, but in autofocus 4, I make sure that the focus point will circulate all the way around the screen, kind of like Pac-Man. In exposure 1, you see ISO setting. I always use the button on the camera for this, or even the function menu, I guess, but let's look at it here. I can choose a discrete ISO number as well as the range of ISO sensitivities available as you scroll through them after hitting the ISO button on the back of the camera. I do sometimes use auto ISO, where I have the ISO auto minimum shutter speed set to standard right now. That sets ISO sensitivity to no lower than about the reciprocal of your focal length. But sometimes I want the camera to choose a bit faster or slower shutter speed than that, which I can customize here. I might use slower if I am photographing something still, or I might use faster if I have a lens without optical stabilization, or I'm photographing something that isn't quite so still. In metering mode, which is another item that I always change on the function menu, I have it set to center, where the camera will look at a portion of the scene in the center of the frame to calculate exposure. But I could change this depending upon the environment. Moving on to color/white balance/image processing 1. We have white balance first, which I generally adjust using the function button, but here we get to the same options. I generally put the camera back on the shelf set to auto, so I'm ready for anything, but of course I might change this for my situation. I have dynamic range optimizer off, but if I'm capturing images in JPEG, I might turn this on to preserve detail in light and shadow. Creative style, another item that I do adjust from the function menu usually. I use standard, vivid, or landscape the most often. If I am capturing still images in RAW, those adjustments made are not going to be in my RAW file, but it at least allows me to visualize what I might do in post-processing. If I'm capturing in JPEG, this is a way to almost pre-edit your photos. Sometimes I even adjust the contrast, saturation, or sharpness down here. Same really goes for video too. If I'm capturing video, I choose an option here as well. I want to point out picture profiles, though this is something that I have not toyed with very much. However, it is another way to adjust the characteristics of your still image or video, and I would actually like to dive into this a little bit more in the future. One item I want to discuss in the focus assist section is peaking setting. When I am manually focusing, this will highlight the in-focus areas. I have chosen mid sensitivity and red as the highlight color. I have changed the highlight color in the past when it blends in too well with the subject. I find that red typically stands out pretty well, so that's typically what I have it set on. In Shooting Assist, I did toy with the face registration where you can register and prioritize faces, but I haven't actually found myself using it in the real world. I can see how it would be very handy for like wedding photography, where you have a group of people, but you also want the bride's face to be the one the camera chooses to focus on. And to our next menu, Purple Camera Settings 2 and the Movie 1 page. I typically use manual exposure, and I typically have my file format set at 4K and my record setting at 30p 100 megabits per second. I post my videos in 4K at 30 frames per second. However, I occasionally switch this over to 1080 and 120 frames per second if I want to do a bit of slow-mo. I find that upscaling it to 4K for the purposes of a YouTube video is completely acceptable. On the next page, Movie 2, I set my autofocus drive speed and my autofocus tracking sensitivity depending on the situation. Once I got into the habit of doing this, I miss this option when I don't see it on other cameras. I actually really like being able to slow down the autofocus in video, especially for nature videography. On the shutter/steady shot page, I have occasionally turned silent shooting on when being quiet is my priority. And then jumping to the display/auto review 1 page. You can choose whether to activate the EVF or the LCD screen on the back of the camera, but I actually set a button on the camera to do this, so I don't use this menu option. Jumping to Custom Operation 1, we have those custom keys. Here I will show you the things I have changed as well as the buttons I use the most often. The AF on button now is a focus magnifier, so I can punch into the frame to see what is in focus. This is especially helpful when I'm manually focusing. I made the center button enable bright monitoring, and this is incredibly useful during astrophotography. I set the down button to switch between the LCD screen and the EVF. I generally use the EVF, however, if I want to capture, for example, a low angle photo using the LCD screen flipped up, I just touch this button. And then the last thing I change, and actually adjust depending upon what I'm doing that day, is the lens function button. Not all lenses have a function button, but if they do, it can be helpful to program this. Right now, I have it set to cycle between full frame and APS-C mode. That being said, I may also set this to focus hold. So if I'm in continuous focus, but I want the camera to stop focusing and hold there, I just press and hold the button. You can also set the buttons for different configurations for movie shooting, but right now I have them all set to be the same as still photography. And then we have the function menu settings. On top is the still photography menu. The slots here that I have changed or use often are the drive mode. I have this slot configured to choose full frame or APS-C mode. This is typically where I choose my creative style. And I can also turn steady shot on or off here depending on if I'm using a tripod or not. I also have this slot set to turn face and eye detect on or off. And then the movie function menu looks much the same. The next thing I change in the menu on any camera I receive is to turn off any audio signals. I really don't like it when my camera beeps at me. Into the green network menu. I generally leave the camera in airplane mode, which means that my battery life is preserved because my camera is not using Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I don't change anything in the blue playback menu, so let's jump to the yellow setup menu, but jumping to page 2. I do have touch operation turned on right now, but you may have noticed in the button configuration menu, the C4 button defaults to turning touch off and on. Raymond always likes touch off. I tend to like it turned on, but I like the quick access to turn it off if it gets in the way. Moving on to the setup 4 page and date and time setup, and the setup 5 page with the area setting. I generally change these when I am traveling so that my photos and videos show the corrected date and time. And then further down the page, this is where I format my memory cards. And in record media settings, I have the camera set to start with slot 1, and then if there is a second card, it will act as an overflow when slot 1 fills up. However, I might change this to simultaneous if I want to record the same image to both cards, if I'm feeling risk averse because I'm capturing something extra important. A wedding is my best example of this. And then in File/Folder settings for still images, I might start a new folder if I am using interval timer to create a time lapse. This keeps the files segregated. And then in version, I can see my firmware version for the camera and lens so that I can compare it to Sony's support site to see if I need to do a firmware update. Save/load settings can be helpful if you want to transfer your settings, if you, for example, have a second body. And setting reset is very helpful if you make a whole bunch of settings changes, realize that you've gotten in too deep and you can't quite figure out why your camera is misbehaving. You can reset your settings and start from scratch. It's good practice. And onto the gray My menu. This is where you can put your most commonly used menu items so that you have easy access. Right now, I only have 4 items on this list, but I do change this relatively often. It depends on what I'm doing with my camera that day or what camera I'm using. I have my interval timer settings here. I use it often enough that I don't want to scroll through too many menu options to find it. And then the next 3 are likely to be changed. I have PC remote function and USB power supply on here because I was testing an external interval timer. And then I have pixel shift multi-shooting here to remind me to test this feature out. It's a bit of a nag for myself every time I see it. And then looking at the last page on the menus is where to go to change the items on the My menu. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, there are a lot of menu options on cameras these days, and Sony menus are the most extensive. You have so much flexibility to make the camera work for you and how you like to shoot. I appreciate that, but it can be intimidating at first. So using your camera's manual to guide you through any settings that you aren't sure about is an easy way to learn. It's what I do with every single camera that I get in here. And Sony and everybody else does have all their manuals online. Also, I showed you how I have my a7R 4 set right now. But the beauty of settings is that we can change them. So don't feel like you have to get your settings just right and then never touch them again. I encourage you to experiment if you want. Especially if you have a camera that has fewer buttons and dials, it can be extremely helpful to customize them and your function menu so that you have an easier time using the camera so that you then get more of the photos and videos that you want. Thanks again to KEH for continuing to support this channel. If you are curious what your gear might be worth or you are interested in maybe purchasing some used gear, my links are in the description. You are supporting this channel as well as a good company in KEH when you use those links. If this video was helpful to you, please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you for watching.